Good evening, ladles and jelly spoons, and welcome to the Distilled Dangerzone. Oh, God, I've had a stroke in the first 5 seconds. Anyway, welcome to the Distilled Dangerzone, the show where we turn hard, drink hard, and where every G we pull comes with a T. Tonight on the drinks menu, I've got Rio Punch Monster Energy drink with gin. So we'll see how that turns out later in the video, I guess. Anyway, this episode is called the F-5, the boring jet that can never die. Now, the F-5 probably isn't the first thing you think of when somebody asks you to think of the most successful fighter aircraft ever. In fact, it's about as remarkable as finding a dog poo on a pavement. It's an unassuming design that evolved from Northrop's N156 concept, which coincidentally also spawned the T-38 Talon jet trainer. Now, if we want to get pedantic, and let's be honest, you're watching this channel, so we can trace this delicious concept back further to the N102 Fang. I wasn't going to include this originally, but then I found this line on Wikipedia, which might genuinely be the understatement of the century. While the Fang was ultimately overlooked in favour of the Lockheed 104 Starfighter, Northrop's interest in a lightweight fighter concept would ultimately come to fruition with the F-5 Freedom Fighter, itself spawning a moderately successful fighter family. We'll come back to that moderately successful fighter family statement at the end of the video, but the N102 ultimately set the tone for the N156 goal of a bargain bin fighter. If bargain bins could reduce you to a fine mist over your local postcode while travelling faster than Mach 1. With the first prototype appearing at the back end of July of 1959, the F-5 stretched, had a swig of water, and then proceeded to teabag the competition. It proved itself out of the gate to be quite a manoeuvrable, reliable and cost-effective fighter, and consequently found itself being exported under co-production and licensing agreements, as well as just generally being bought by countries such as Canada, the Republic of China, more commonly known in the modern era as the country of Taiwan, and yes, I deliberately included that last bit to piss off Winnie the Pooh. The Republic of Korea, Spain, Venezuela, Iran, we'll come back to them in a little bit later, and Switzerland, ultimately resulting in an aircraft used worldwide in around 30 different countries. You get the idea. Right out of the gates, countries were collecting this thing like TikTok collects bad life choices. But ladles and jelly spoons, this is just the beginning, for the F-5 and the T-38 were merely the calm before the proverbial storm. In 1966, Northrop took the N156 a step further and started feeding it protein shakes and developed the N300. And then they gave it more protein and developed the P530, which was basically the exact same thing, but now for some reason it has a big wing, larger leading edge extensions, underwing inlets, and for some reason an extra vertical stabilizer. But Northrop felt like they were missing a little something, so they added a little bit more protein. And hey presto bobsy potato, the YF-17 was birthed and ready to bully MiGs in your local area. Now, it doesn't take a genius to work out that the YF-17 and the FA-18 Hornet look suspiciously similar, and that's because the YF-17 was effectively the prototype for the FA-18. Basically that one guy who disappears on school summer break and comes back looking like Benjamin Swallow. It is, however, worth noting the FA-18 comes in a couple of succulent exotic flavours. Now this one's cheating a bit, but first of all, you've mistaken me for someone who actually gives a shit, and secondly, it is in fact its own aircraft. For whatever reason, Boeing took one look at the Hornet and mumbled something to the effect of needs more protein and bulked it up so hard it turned into the FA-18 Super Hornet, which then personally escorted the F-14 to an early retirement home in 2006. I would be sympathetic, but given the F-14 brought about its own demise from its very inception by producing an expensive niche fighter in comparatively low numbers, I couldn't really give two literal flying fucks, and I say that in the most literal sense because, well, you'll find out later in the video. All hail the true saviour, the F-111B, which was objectively superior in almost every metric. Tragically, I've also produced a 40-page citation-ridden manifesto on this exact hill, and I will now die on it. And yes, I fully intend on making a second video to put the topic to bed once and for all, by which I mean tucking it in, kissing it goodnight, and then flogging any Tomcat discourse to death with a dead horse in the form of a PowerPoint presentation. That said, the Super Hornet also replaced the Australian F-111C, which is adorable really, because they effectively went from a strategic sledgehammer that can delete your capital before lunchtime and traded it for a tactical fly swatter that loiters aggressively around Australia's coastline and then wondered why the wallabies looked mildly disappointed. Now, for those of you wondering how Boeing of all people ended up with the FA-18 design, well, it's because McDonnell Douglas helped develop the original Hornet alongside Northrop. But then they got bought up by Boeing, and Boeing sacked off a third of their quality department and then acted surprised when their new airliners started developing a strong interest in the nearest hillside. Could be a coincidence, but after the amount of oddly specific independent YouTube comments I've come across that start with something along the lines of, I used to work at Boeing right after the merger and ... I feel morally obligated to at least give it a passing mention. The FA-18 also spawned the High Alpha research vehicle in 1987, or the HARV for short. Plane shockingly does exactly what it says on the tin, and for all intents and purposes would have been John Boyd's wet dream, if it wasn't for the fact it was derived from an airframe that was a competitor to the F-16 and embodied precisely none of quote-unquote his theories. Again, this is effectively a glorified F-5 that got a degree in discovered experimental aerodynamics. The aircraft included features like thrust vectoring, a research flight control system, and four-body strakes that were on little hinged surfaces that deployed at high angles of attack to increase yaw control after the rudder emotionally checked out. Notably, this aircraft did its thrust vectoring thing in January of 1993 during Phase 2 of the program, about 3 whole years before the Russians played catch-up with the Su-37 thrust vectoring demonstrator in 1996. The X-53 was also basically an FA-18, but different. Different in what way, I hear you cry? Actually, I don't. This is a recording, so I can't hear anything outside the voices in my head, and occasionally that annoying blackbird that keeps screaming, wah, bah, outside my window at 6 in the fucking morning like it's auditioning in front of Simon Cowell for the title of Bird's Got No Fucking Talent, outside of annoying me in 6 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, this aircraft was another NASA experimental plane which was used to research an active aeroelastic wing from about 1996 until 2001. Basically a wing that twists to roll the aircraft instead of using conventional aileron control surfaces. I'd like to say that this is a new technology, but the reality is the Wright brothers used similar, albeit simpler mechanics, which were dubbed wing warping for their first aircraft in 1903. So it very much feels like a case of 1 step forward and 2 steps back. However, bendy wings powered by science and the use of fancy new materials is cool, so I'll let NASA and their X-53 get a pass on this one. NASA also indicates that the results were generally positive and implied to be relatively cost-effective to implement, but for whatever reason we haven't really seen this technology implemented on aircraft since, which is a bit of a shame because I can't help but wonder how good they would be for stealth applications. He says as someone without any experience in stealth applications. Meanwhile, back in the 1980s, Northrop returned to their roots with the F-5 and produced the F-20 Tigershark. Plane was basically an F-5E but with a single General Electric F-404 engine, new materials, avionics and improved leading edge route extensions, although not quite to the extent of the YF-17 or the FA-18 or the FA-18 Super Hornet. You get the idea. They were there but not that big. I would also like to start off by saying that the F-20 is probably up there as one of the more sexy looking fighters the US has ever made, up until the point you mount a Name 9 Sidewinder on it and suddenly it looks like a toddler wearing its parents' shoes. From a dogfighting point of view, this aircraft was very much a competitor to the F-16 and probably single-handedly made John Boyd simultaneously cream himself and question his life choices, since the F-20 could basically match the dogfighting performance of an F-16, while notably not being an F-16, but rather, you guessed it, just another glorified F-5. At this point, John Boyd had been beanbagged by 2 separate plane designs derived from the F-5 that match his F-16's performance, while notably not including a single slither of quote-unquote his work. It's almost like design engineers knew what they were doing before he published any of quote-unquote his work on EM theory. I keep saying his work, and if you're wondering why, I'll link a video in the description on John Boyd's fraud where he basically stole half of his ideas, I say in inverted quotations, on EM theory. So he didn't actually come up with it, he just, I don't know, the story's a bit convoluted to be honest. Coincidentally, as stated in an earlier video, John Boyd also wanted to give the F-16 the F-5's radar, which is now making me question if the F-16 is just John Boyd's self-insert fanfiction rendition of the F-5. Anyway, tinfoil hats aside, the F-20's unit cost was about $12.8 million US dollars at the time, a full $2.8 million cheaper than the F-16C. But then that triggered General Dynamics and they went on to propose the trimmed down F-16SC, which was another $1.9 million cheaper to operate than the F-20, at least according to the July 1986 GAO Aircraft Procurement Air Force Defense Fighter Competition report. Try saying that 10 times fast. But according to a report by The Atlantic in 1984, the F-20 was more than 50% cheaper to operate. However, the F-20 was ultimately not procured because while its procurement and operation were cost effective and fighter maneuverability was, according to a Congress report in 1985, on par with the F-16, its range and payload capacity were not. In the end, despite being one of the most expensive privately funded projects of its time and having 3 of these aircraft built, the F-20 project for Northrop was sadly fruitless. But not because it was a bad plane, mind you, but because the US government, in its infinite galaxy brain wisdom, did the following. Step 1. Remove the export restrictions that originally created the F-20's niche in the first place and start flogging the F-16 to your mates. Step 2. Still block Northrop from selling the F-20 to places like Taiwan. Step 3. Subsidize a foreign competitor in the form of Israel's IAI-LAVI program. And Step 4. Let the F-16 roam the world with fancy brochures while every scrap of the F-20 marketing had to sit in government bureaucracy for months before anyone was allowed to show it to a fucking customer. Shockingly, this did not result in robust sales for Northrop. And suddenly Northrop's tendency for fraud following on from this seems mildly more understandable after essentially being bent over the table and thoroughly bummed by Uncle Sam for daring to fund their own fucking project. Worse still, because Boeing had effectively gobbled up the future FA-18 prospects via the Super Hornet, coupled with the fact the US government had effectively castrated the F-20 through what could only be really viewed in the modern age as favouritism towards the F-16, at least at a preliminary level. Northrop was effectively incapable of profiting off their own fucking design after 1990, despite the fact that everybody and their ferret seemed to be making some derivative of their aircraft, but a little bit more on that later. My point is, you can hate Northrop for pulling off a lot of questionable shit like fraud, contract violations and ethical breaches. I don't think anyone would disagree with me when I say that doing any of that shit is bad. I feel like that's a pretty safe take. That said, with the context of the F-20 also makes some of that at least slightly more understandable. Also, I lied, the F-20 likely turned into the N400, an entry to the American TX competition, coincidentally a competition to replace the T-38 Talon, and was produced by BAE Systems and Scaled Composites, a subsidiary of Northrop. It too used a variant of the General Electric F404 engine, looked like a cross between the BAE Hawk and Northrop's F-20, and just generally looked like a pretty cool plane. I mean, look at the curves on that thing. It looks, oh, chef's kiss. Right up until you look at the wings, which look strangely out of place for some reason. Anyway, I think it's a pretty cool plane. And then it died in 2017, when both companies yeeted themselves out the program faster than Russian officials out of 16th floor windows after a certain tin of poo catches them with their trousers around their ankles. The fact that there's a whole Wikipedia page dedicated to suspicious Russia-related deaths is both morbidly amusing and concerning. It reads like an Agatha Christie novel, only it's shit and everybody knows who the murderer is. And for those who are just as morbidly curious as myself, there's been about 9 deaths from people suspiciously falling out of windows since 2022. Moving swiftly on, much like the FA-18, the F-5 also had its fair share of weird experiments, the first of which was the X-29. And while at first glance it doesn't really look much like an F-5, probably something to do with the fact it looks like its wings are Pritt-sticked on the wrong way, the front fuselage section is in fact from an F-5. And to absolutely nobody's surprise, it too used a variant of the General Electric F404, but in a weird crossover episode that nobody asked for, in addition to an engine from an FA-18 and the F-5's frontal fuselage, the X-29 also used the main landing gear and flight control actuators from an F-16. probably sensors from an F-14, and because this aircraft is apparently some weird fever dream, an iteration of the Honeywell flight control computers derived from none other than the fucking SR-71. This is why I love this plane over the Su-47, because it's basically an amalgamation of all the planes. Even more hilarious was that the camera crew tasked with taking pictures of the aircraft while it was in flight, with Ted, I'm going to butcher this name so badly, Ted Wierzbanowski, stating, quote, "We did have a real problem in taking pictures of tufts and cones at slow speeds, and even in high angles of attack, because we didn't have a chase plane that was capable of doing it. We didn't have any way of mounting external cameras to the airplane without affecting its structural stuff. I got an A37 and an F-15 because we didn't know which one was going to be able to hack it as a photo chase." Which I find hilarious, because they effectively went from one extreme to the other because they genuinely didn't know which one would perform better as a chase plane. And finally, we have the F-5. But now it has mumps for some reason. This is the NASA Shaped Sonic Boom Demonstrator, also an F-5, which ironically this time had its forward fuselage modified to attempt to demonstrate that supersonic aerodynamics aren't immune to being beaten into submission by American engineers. And this particular F-5 did in fact demonstrate that the sonic boom can be tamed by the aircraft nose equivalent of a flying speedboat. So if you ever find yourself on a supersonic airliner in future, raise a cup of tomato juice to the glorious supersonic schnoz walrus. The song Silent Thunder by Crazy Licks also seems oddly fitting here, and outside of being about planes and spawning in 2019, it is probably the most unapologetically 80s sounding song since Mr. Big decided an electric drill was a perfectly acceptable lead guitar technique. The fact that Top Gun Maverick didn't use it is a war crime punishable by forcing music director to refuel stratotankers with a fucking silly straw. Now, with most of the weird shit out of the way on the F-5, it's time to look at the F-5 from further afield, and it's also, funnily enough, tinfoil hat time again. Now, this is low-hanging fruit as a joke, but I'm scripting this at 2:15 in the morning and I stopped caring about 2 hours ago. Introducing the fuck. Or the FCK-1. Taiwan was facing an issue with their aging F-5 fleet and was in need of a suitable replacement. Northrop was keen on selling Taiwan the F-20. Taiwan was keen on buying the F-20. But you know the drill by now. The US government said lol no, and now both entities ended up having a chip off their shoulder. But while Northrop went on to do illegal financial fun time, Taiwan went about building their own indigenous F-20. And consequently, in 1989, the first literal flying fuck took flight. Now, I don't have any concrete evidence to support a direct lineage, but given the circumstances and the fact Taiwan already had a license to build F-5s, and coupled with the fact that the general layout, size and performance metrics of the aircraft are suspiciously similar to the F-20, I find it difficult to argue there isn't at least some F-20, or at the very least F-5 DNA floating around in the aircraft, especially when you consider it uses the same AN/APG-67 radar. That said, and perhaps much to the dismay of Northrop again, because there's nothing like beating a man when he's down, General Dynamics, the makers of the F-16, did quietly help out Taiwan with this aircraft, and consequently I would not be surprised if a little bit of the F-16's influence made it in there too. There's something oddly familiar about that cockpit layout, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Poor Northrop. First the US government violates its rear end, and then General Dynamics shows up and gets sucked off by the day that Uncle Sam told Northrop wasn't allowed to bring to prom. The AI DCT-5 is also an advanced trainer that's worth an honourable mention here because it's derived from the FCK-1. Fast forward now to halfway around the world in 1997, Iran announced that they had made a new and completely original indigenous fighter. This aircraft was completely original and is in no way an F-5, despite the fact it looks exactly like an F-5 in pretty much every single conceivable way. This is a reoccurring theme for the Iranian F-5 derivatives, but I actually struggle to find much information on this plane outside the fact that everybody seems to unanimously agree that it's basically an F-5. Presumably unsatisfied with the comparisons between the, I'm going to butcher this name again, the Azarkesh and the F-5, the Azarkesh being that plane that I showed you before that is completely original. The Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force went out of their way to make their definitely not F-5 look like an F-5 by changing basically nothing and calling it a don't know how to pronounce that name either. Randomly giving it a twin tail and a blue and yellow paint job so it looked like a member of the Blue Angels was dropped on its head as a child and performed their own display group called the Blue Angles. It specialises in disappointment instead of aerobatic displays. But rest assured, because Big Boss Man here of the Air Force of the Islamic Republic of Iran Army Brigadier General Ahmed Migani said the jet fighter is up to date in terms of aerodynamic balance and possessing missile and radar system. Whatever that means. Is that not the bare minimum that a fighter jet should have from the fucking 1960s? My guy might as well have gone on to say that it probably has an engine and, if you're lucky, some functional flight instruments. But it somehow gets better because he confidently claimed that the achievements Iran had made in manufacture of jet fighters indicated that the economic sanctions imposed by the enemy in the past 30 years have been ineffective. Which is a pretty fucking bold statement from a nation that appears to be fielding none other than the yellow gyrocopter as it's part of its naval air assets. I'm not sure what drugs my guy's been taking, but I want some if it's enough to make you think an FA-18 Hornet from IKEA with 45 chromosomes missing is the pinnacle of aerospace ingenuity. Weirdly, they must have thought exactly the same because in 2017 they introduced the Kausar, which... Have we not gone back to square one at this point? The extent of Iran's indigenous aircraft development seems to be make copy of American plane, add extra vertical stabilizer, remove said extra vertical stabilizer, call it 100% indigenously made, and call it a day. Thusly, my main takeaway from this is that Iran spent about 23 fucking years learning how to make essentially the exact same fucking plane that they already had 3 times. Moving back over to, actual competent aerospace, ladles and jelly spoons, it's time to stick our tinfoil hats back onto our noggin as we're going to dive into the final chapter of our F5 journey, when we scrape the bottom of the proverbial barrel so hard the neighbours on the floor below will wonder if we're trying to reenact the Great Escape. Now, I wasn't planning on including random paper planes that didn't get off the drawing board, but this plane concept is critical to understanding the next 2 planes on this list, which could be considered convoluted evolutions of the F5, and if you're wondering why I've not brought up a picture of it on screen, you'll find out later. This joint Northrop and Dornier project was, from what I can gather, was first conceived in 1978. This midnight rendezvous resulted in an aircraft concept called the ND-102, which for all intents and purposes is a YF-17 with a fedora and a fake European mustache, which of course in turn was developed from the F5. It's basically like playing Russian dolls at this point, except each one is not only smaller but also more disappointing than the last. Now, I'm not going to show you what the ND-102 first looked like because that would ruin my fun surprise at the end, and the project was ultimately cancelled in 1984, but I've got poor viewer attention, so I'll tease you with this wind tunnel test model that was displayed in 1983 at the Paris Air Show. Ultimately, Northrop and Dornier went their separate ways, mainly because Northrop needed to start focusing on some interesting developments back at home that definitely weren't classified, but not before Dornier had wandered off and put their fat fingers in the pie of another program, the TKF-90. Now, one of the earlier designs of the TKF-90 program took the form of this suspiciously familiar layout. Unfortunately, my brain physically rejects seeing anything other than an YF-17 in this design. That's probably because Northrop is confirmed to have actually provided wind tunnel test data to Dornier for this particular layout. The TKF during 1980 did, however, also flirt with other configurations such as this Delta wing. And eventually, in 1983, a year before Northrop and Dornier formally disbanded, this TKF-90 model showed up at the Paris Air Show. Just take a moment for that to sink in case that last picture wasn't a big enough hint. The Eurofighter Typhoon of all planes can be at least partially logically traced all the way back to the fucking F5. Moving back to the ND-102, while its connection is a little bit on the tentative side with respect to the Eurofighter, I deliberately didn't show you this early concept model for the aircraft in case anyone clocked on as to where the ultimate end goal for this project was. Notice those canted twin tails, the tragically absent horizontal stabilator, and a wing so generously proportioned it could probably double up as one of those umbrellas at beer gardens. Anyway, in the early 80s, the US Air Force issued a request for information for what will become the Advanced Tactical Fighter program. Northrop, high on leftover Dornier strudel and possibly illegal creative accounting, drops a sack of proposals that all look suspiciously either like the ND-102 or the F-5. To be fair, if I've collectively dropped somewhere in the region of $20 million with Dornier on a plane that ultimately didn't go anywhere, I'd be recycling that shit as much as possible too. The goal of the program then shifted slightly, and Northrop was tasked with modifying their designs further by incorporating things like serpentine ducts, planform alignment, and exotic materials, ultimately providing a reduced radar cross-section that was the very antithesis of Jimmy Savile's reflective blue tracksuit. The concept of stealth on aircraft at this stage was also coincidentally young enough that Jimmy Savile probably would have taken a keen interest. And then the YF-23 suddenly appeared, and now you have to live with the knowledge that the Black Widow 2 is literally just a glorified Tiger 2. So the next time someone says how futuristic and cool the YF-23 is, ruin their day by telling them it's an F-5. Don't elaborate and run off into the sunset, leaving the poor victim in an existential crisis. But if that wasn't succulent enough, Northrop released an image, this image in particular, that appears to be a Navy FA-XX 6th generation fighter proposal that looks suspiciously like a YF-23 and thus logically is also just another glorified F-5. And so, we have reached the closing point of this video where we circle back to the quote from Wikipedia. While the fan was ultimately overlooked in favour of the Lockheed 104 Starfighter, Northrop's interest in a lightweight fighter concept would ultimately come to fruition with the F-5 Freedom Fighter, itself spawning a moderately successful fighter family. I've been your host Shizzlesticks, and as always, goodbye and thanks for watching. I've also got to now find the stop button while inebriated under the influence of energy drink and alcohol, which should be fun. I found it.